What you are about to understand is not simply a story about weapons, warships, or the theater of military confrontation in the Persian Gulf. What you are about to understand is something far more consequential, a lesson about the nature of knowledge itself, about the gap between institutional confidence and operational reality, and about how the most powerful military apparatus in human history can be brought to the edge of catastrophe not by superior firepower, but by the precise exploitation of its own certainty. Stay with me until the end of this analysis, because what unfolds across the waters of the Arabian Sea in these hours is, I would argue, one of the most instructive case studies in modern asymmetric warfare that we have yet witnessed. And if you think the opening engagement is revealing, what comes in the second half of this account will fundamentally change how you think about the future of naval warfare altogether. Let us begin with what Western media consistently refuses to examine with any analytical seriousness: the relationship between perception and vulnerability. The USS Abraham Lincoln, one of the crown jewels of American naval power projection, has been patrolling the same waters for 62 days. 62 days of war. 62 days during which Iranian strategists, intelligence officers, and engineers have been doing something that Western commentary almost never credits them with doing: watching, learning, calculating, and building. The dominant narrative in Western media frames Iran as a reactive power, a desperate actor, flailing against overwhelming force. What the events of this particular morning expose is something categorically different. What they expose is a military establishment that had been conducting a patient, methodical, and deeply sophisticated study of its adversaries' behavioral patterns, technological limitations, and most critically, its psychological vulnerabilities. And it is that last element, the psychological dimension, that I want you to hold in your mind as we proceed. Because the most dangerous weapon Iran deployed on this morning was not made of steel or composite material. It was not powered by a rocket motor or guided by a satellite. It was constructed entirely from observation, from 62 days of watching how American sailors respond to familiar threats, how automated systems classify familiar contacts, and how institutional confidence in proven solutions creates the precise cognitive blind spots that a sufficiently patient adversary can exploit with devastating precision. The first act of this engagement begins, not with an explosion, not with a radar contact, but with a piece of diplomatic theater that Western analysts would later describe with characteristic superficiality as a coincidence. At 6:00 inches the morning, Iran submits new peace proposals through Pakistani intermediaries. Washington receives the framework. The carrier strike group receives word. And for a crew that has been at war for 62 consecutive days, exhausted, vigilant, haunted by the psychological weight of sustained combat operations, the possibility of peace is not merely news. It is oxygen. It does something to human attention that no amount of training can fully inoculate against. It redirects it. It softens the edges of professional vigilance with something altogether more human: hope. But what comes next is even more revealing, because while every command circuit on the Abraham Lincoln is carrying fragments of the diplomatic story, while watch officers are quietly processing the possibility that this war might soon be over, something else is already 3 miles from the carrier's hull, something that has been in the water for 72 hours, something that was never designed to be intercepted because it was never designed to be found. The unmanned underwater drone that Iran launched 3 days prior to those peace proposals is, in my assessment, one of the most conceptually elegant weapons deployed in this conflict. Not because of its lethality, its warhead is, by the standards of modern naval ordnance, relatively modest, but because of the philosophy embedded in its design, it moves at 4 knots, the speed of a slow walk. It generates no biological noise, no crew-generated acoustic signature, no mechanical complexity beyond the low-frequency hum of an electric drive that sits acoustically at the precise boundary between a detectable contact and background ocean noise. It was not built to outrun American anti-submarine warfare systems. It was built to be M-classified by them, to be logged, assessed, dismissed, and forgotten, to exploit the gap between what automated classification systems were designed to find. Submarines, fast-moving contacts, objects with complex acoustic signatures, and what this weapon actually is. Almost nothing moving in a perfectly straight line at a perfectly consistent speed toward coordinates that were calculated from 62 days of observing where the Abraham Lincoln spends its time. This is the analytical point that I think deserves far more attention than Western commentators have been willing to give it. The drone is not a technological marvel in the conventional sense. It does not represent a leap in propulsion or guidance or warhead design. What it represents is a leap in understanding. Iranian engineers and strategists understood something fundamental about the epistemological limitations of American naval detection systems, that those systems are built around the assumption that a threat will behave like a threat, that it will move at threatening speeds, generate threatening signatures, and behave in ways that distinguish it categorically from the ambient noise of the ocean. By building a weapon that does none of these things, they did not defeat American technology. They defeated American assumptions. And this is where the story becomes, I would argue, genuinely instructive for anyone seeking to understand the character of this conflict. Because at 3:00 inches the morning, 3 hours and 14 minutes after Petty Officer David Oye first detected this contact, he files a report. Same bearing, same speed, straight track, no deviation. The institutional response is dismissive, consistent with large marine biologics, no further action required. And here we encounter something that I have observed repeatedly in my analysis of Western military institutions, the tendency to trust the automated system over the human observer, to weight classification algorithms over accumulated human judgment, to treat the output of a machine as more authoritative than the careful, sustained, patient attention of a trained professional who is telling you with 9 hours of continuous data that something moving in a perfectly straight line at a perfectly consistent speed is not a whale shark. Stay with me, because this is where the narrative completely changes. Because what Petty Officer OC does after his reports are dismissed is not what a passive observer does. He does not log his concern and return to other duties. He keeps watching and he keeps listening with the discipline and the patience that, frankly, I find more instructive than the entire technological apparatus of the carrier strike group. He spends those 9 hours building something that no automated system in his formation possesses, a complete acoustic portrait of this contact, the precise frequency signature of its electric motor, the specific interval of its acoustic cycles, the exact way it sounds reflects off the thermocline layer 40 meters below the surface. He is not waiting for permission to understand what he is looking at. He is in the finest tradition of genuine intelligence work, constructing knowledge from data that his institution has decided is unimportant. And if you think that's surprising, the next part is even more significant, because at 8:13 inches the morning, when the contact is finally reclassified as a possible threat, it is already 0.7 of a mile from the carrier's hull, inside the minimum engagement range of every torpedo countermeasure in the formation. The geometry that defensive doctrine requires, the distance, the time, the space to deploy and maneuver, has already been consumed by 72 hours of patient approach and 9 hours of institutional inattention. The formation is not responding to a threat. It is reacting to a crisis that was created by its own classification processes. Every torpedo countermeasure that deploys in the next 10 minutes does so at marginal geometry, not ideal geometry, not the geometry that doctrine was written for. And the acoustic decoys that enter the water and begin broadcasting the carrier's own signature find nothing to seduce. Because this weapon does not chase acoustic signatures, it follows coordinates. It is entirely indifferent to the formation's defensive responses. It was programmed 72 hours ago and will follow its instructions until it either runs out of water or a weapon finds it first. The helicopter that arrives at 821 drops its torpedo in the drone's projected path and acquires it in 3 seconds. The intercept geometry is nearly clean. And then at 0.3 of a mile, the drone executes its single programmed evasion, one 90 degrees turn built into its guidance architecture for precisely this terminal scenario. The torpedo passes 44 m behind it. The drone resumes its bearing. The helicopter has no second weapon loaded. The escorts are too far. At roughly 1/10 of a mile from the carrier group, with the all-hands circuit aboard the vessel already broadcasting the order to brace for impact, Petty Officer OC transmits something that has no formal designation in American naval doctrine. It is not a standard report, not a coded alert, and not an established targeting protocol. It is something improvised under extreme pressure, the complete acoustic profile he has been building since 0300 hours that morning, compressed, refined, and structured into a targeting filter that captures the drone's behavioral signature in a way no automated system had yet managed to achieve. That transmission is sent not upward into command channels, but laterally to a second helicopter that has been silently orbiting the engagement zone since 0814, armed with a torpedo but lacking reliable acquisition data on a target this small, this fast, and this close to the cluttered acoustic environment of a carrier battle group. Under normal conditions, the probability of a clean lock would be marginal. But OC's dataset changes the equation entirely. It provides what the system lacked: coherence. The helicopter acquires the drone in just over a second, 1.1 seconds to be precise. The torpedo is released, enters the water, and begins its short, decisive pursuit. At 220 meters from the carrier's hull, it finds its target. The detonation that follows does not sink the USS Abraham Lincoln, but it reaches her in a way that matters just as much. A violent pressure wave propagates outward through the water, transfers into the hull, and spreads through the vessel's structural frame. It is not a breach, but a shock that behaves like a blunt instrument against steel and human systems alike. Compartments shudder, equipment fails simultaneously across multiple sections, personnel are thrown off balance, some lifted off their feet entirely by the force transmitted through the deck plating. A 100,000-ton ship is forced, briefly and violently, into a motion it was never designed to experience. When the water settles, the carrier remains afloat. Operational capability is degraded, but not destroyed. 8 personnel are injured, 2 seriously. The hull holds, and then comes the response. Within minutes, passive signal analysis conducted during the hours leading up to the engagement is cross-referenced with the drone's acoustic signature. The origin point is identified, not the drone itself, but the infrastructure behind it. A launch facility inland, approximately 140 kilometers from the coast. A research and development site that has, for years, functioned as the core of the program responsible for the system just engaged. By 0917, the facility is gone. Cruise missiles arrive with precision timing, striking both the operational site and the associated development center. Whatever continuity the program once had is effectively severed in a matter of seconds. Yet, even as the kinetic exchange resolves, the broader situation does not simplify. The Abraham Lincoln remains on station, emergency procedures stabilize internal systems, damage control teams move through compartments, assessing structural integrity. Somewhere in the sonar suite, a petty officer, second class, continues to monitor a blank screen where contact once existed, tracking a bearing out of habit more than expectation. But the engagement in strategic terms is only a preface, because what unfolded with the underwater drone represents only the first layer of a coordinated sequence, one designed not as a single strike, but as a multi-domain operational structure. The diplomatic channels remain open in Islamabad, where peace proposals continue to circulate as if untouched by events at sea. Yet beneath that apparent separation, the architecture of the morning's actions reveals deliberate synchronization. The second engagement begins at 0922. A single missile launch is detected from the Iranian coastline. On its surface, it is unremarkable, an established ballistic profile, a known class of weapon, and a trajectory pattern that the carrier strike group has intercepted dozens of times before. The system aboard the Abraham Lincoln classifies it immediately, routing it into a familiar defensive solution space. The weapon is identified as a variant of the Qam-class ballistic missile. Nothing about it initially suggests deviation from expected behavior. The Aegis system engages its tracking solution. Lieutenant Commander Webb oversees the fire control computation. The intercept probability is calculated at 94%. It is, by all institutional standards, a routine engagement, but the missile is not what it appears to be. Its true design becomes evident only as it ascends. The forward section is not a conventional warhead, but a dispersal mechanism, a hollow payload compartment containing 80 independently guided submunitions. Each unit is compact, precision-shaped, and equipped with its own terminal guidance capability. The structure of the payload is intentional, not designed to survive interception, but to exploit it. The key feature is not explosive yield, but thermal behavior. Because the internal volume of the dispenser contains significant empty space between submunitions, it registers a subtle anomaly in infrared detection systems approximately 4 degrees colder than a standard solid warhead signature. It is a minimal difference, nearly negligible. But in a system calibrated for thousands of prior engagements against conventional threats, that small deviation is the only signal required to introduce uncertainty at the worst possible moment. The implication is clear. The missile is not designed to penetrate defenses directly. It is designed to be intercepted under optimal conditions, exactly as doctrine dictates, and then transform that successful intercept into a secondary attack vector. At 0924, the fire control solution is locked. The intercept proceeds, and then the system begins to realize what it has actually engaged. One deck below the Combat Information Center, in the Passive Infrared Analysis Suite, Petty Officer First Class Layla Hassan observes the anomaly independently. She has been quietly maintaining a personal data set for 19 months, an unauthorized but meticulously structured record of thermal signatures associated with regional missile systems. It is not part of any formal tasking order. It exists outside institutional expectation entirely. She notices the discrepancy immediately. 4.1 degrees below expected baseline. A deviation small enough to be dismissed by automated filtering systems, but consistent across multiple sensor returns. She calls it in. Her assessment is logged, acknowledged, and temporarily deferred pending confirmation. The engagement continues. But Hassan does not stop. She continues working the problem independently, reconstructing trajectory and payload dispersion timing in parallel with the official fire control solution. Within 34 seconds, she develops an alternative engagement concept, not to prevent interception, but to alter the altitude of intercept by a margin small enough to disrupt the intended submunition dispersal geometry. It is an unrequested calculation, entirely unofficial and yet